All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before I get into the book, as you can see up here, we've got President Trump's meeting with the oil and gas executives. Now, I did watch this earlier today, and basically, he was just talking about what they're going to do in Venezuela. Basically, all those people there are like the top oil and gas producers, at least in the Western Hemisphere. I'm sure they got like Exxon and a bunch of other large corporations, plus some more independent oil people and gas people like drillers and riggers and people who have the equipment and people who do the investments only, like investors, stockholders, and they're all there. The Venezuelan capitalists, basically people that are from Venezuela that are high level capitalists, it seems like they were very appreciative of what President Trump did in Venezuela. And also, one of Trump's evidences that what he did in Venezuela is a good thing is that apparently they've named a street after him in Venezuela. And so he claims that, if he was such an oppressor, why would they name a street after him? I mean, it's kind of some evidence. Okay. And, pretty much they were just introducing themselves to the world, which is kind of good. At least they're not doing it in a secret, smoky back room. Although at the end, when they were going to cut the deal, they did turn off the cameras, but that's um, understandable. And so, you can check it out if you want. It's like just a lot of oil guys. And it was kind of funny. He kind of caught the press off guard. He was like, we got some of the richest, most powerful people in the world here. You guys got any questions for him? And the press was like, no, we wanted to like grill you on some stupid American policy stuff that doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on in this meeting. And so he kind of got him there. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of boring if you're not into that type of political stuff, but I think I gave a decent summary there. All right, so we're still on World War II, Tide of Aggression, 1939 to 1941, page 707, American Neutrality and Aid to Britain. When the European War began in September 1939, American public opinion was united in its determination to stay out. The isolationist reaction following American intervention in the First World War and the Paris Peace Conference in 1917 to 1919 had, if anything, become stronger in the 1930s. Historians and publicists were writing extensively to show that Germany had not been solely guilty of beginning the war in 1914 and that the Entente powers had made more than their share of secret treaties seeking selfish territorial aims both before the war and during the fighting. In 1934, a committee of the United States Senate investigated the role played by foreign loans and munition sales to belligerents in getting the United States involved in World War I. Through carelessness of the Roosevelt administration, this committee fell under the control of isolationists led by the chairman, Republican Senator Gerald P. Nye of North Dakota. As a result, the evidence before the committee was mobilized to show that American intervention in World War I had been pushed by bankers and munitions manufacturers, merchants of death, to protect their profits and their interest in the Entente victory in the early years of the war. Well, I mean, are they wrong, though? Did seem like that was what you were talking about in the chapters earlier. Under these influences, American public opinion in the late 30s had an uncomfortable feeling that American youths had been sent to die in 1917 to 1918 for selfish purposes, concealed behind propaganda slogans about the rights of small nations, freedom of the seas, or making the world safe for democracy. I think we've all heard all of those before. These feelings were reinforced in the late 1930s by growing disillusionment with the cynicism of authoritarian aggression and the weakness of British appeasement. All this helped to create a widespread determination to keep out of Europe's constant quarrels in the future and, above all, to avoid any repetition of what was regarded as the error of 1917. The isolationist point of view had been enacted into American statute law not only in the 1920s by restrictions on contact with the League of Nations and other international organizations, but also later in the Roosevelt administration in the so-called Neutrality Acts. These misnamed laws sought to avoid any repetition of the events of 1914 to 1917 by curtailing loans and munition sales to belligerent countries. Originally enacted in 1935 and revised in the next 2 years, these laws provided that export of arms and munitions to belligerents would cease whenever the president proclaimed a state to be a participant in a war outside the Americas. Any materials, including munitions, named by the presidents had to be sold on a cash and carry basis, with full payment and transfer of title before leaving the United States, and had to be transported on foreign ships. The cash, but not the carry provisions, also applied to all other trade with belligerents. In addition, loans to belligerents were forbidden, and American citizens could be warned not to travel on belligerents' ships. An early statute of the Johnson Act of 1934 prevented loans to most European powers by forbidding such loans to countries whose payments were in arrears on their war debts of World War I. Moreover, by a so-called moral embargo, the Roosevelt administration sought to restrict export of war materials on ethical or humanitarian grounds, where no legal basis existed for doing so. Under this provision, for example, airplane manufacturers were asked not to sell planes to countries which had bombed civilians, as Italy had done in Ethiopia, Japan had done in China, or the Soviet Union had done in Finland. In the years 1935 to 1939, the neutrality laws proved to be quite unneutral in practice and a considerable encouragement to aggressors. The Italian attack on Ethiopia showed that an aggressor could arm at his leisure and then, by making an attack, prevent his victims from purchasing from the United States the means to defend himself. These laws gave a great advantage to a state like Italy, which had ships to carry supplies from the United States, or which had cash to buy them here. In contrast with a country like Ethiopia, which had no ships and little cash. By special legislation, the Neutrality Acts had been extended to civil wars to cover the Spanish uprising of 1936 and had cut the recognized government of Spain off from purchasing munitions while the rebel regime continued to obtain such munitions from the Axis powers. The obvious unfairness of these laws in the Sino-Japanese crisis of 1937 persuaded President Roosevelt to refrain from proclaiming a state of war in East Asia, although in fact it was clear to everyone that a war was going on there. Above all, by 1939, it was obvious that the Neutrality Acts were encouraging Nazi aggression, since Germany, by making war on Britain and France, could cut them off from American armaments. For this reason, the Roosevelt administration tried to get Congress to repeal the embargo provision of the Neutrality Acts, but was unable to overcome isolationist opposition led by Senator William E. Burr of Idaho, July 1939. As soon as the war began in Europe, Roosevelt called a special session of Congress to revise the neutrality laws so that the Entente powers could not obtain supplies in the United States. Under the resulting revision of these acts, in November 1939, the embargo on munitions was repealed, and all purchases by belligerents were placed on a cash-and-carry basis. Loans to belligerent powers were forbidden. Americans were excluded from travel on belligerent ships, and American ships were not to be armed, to carry munitions, or to go to any areas the President had proclaimed as combat areas. Under this last provision, all European ports on the Baltic or Atlantic from Bergen south to the Pyrenees were closed to American ships. As the war spread, these areas were extended by proclamation. The collapse of France in June 1940, combined with the arrogant Japanese demands on the Netherlands East Indies and French Indochina, August to September 1940, and the signing of the Tripartite Pact gave rise to a severe crisis in American foreign affairs. We have already indicated the danger to American security which could arise from the French fleet or Dakar falling into German hands or from a successful Nazi invasion of Britain. This danger raised the controversy over American foreign policy to a feverish pitch and widened the extremes of public opinion. These extremes ranged from the advocates of immediate intervention into the war on the side of Britain on the one hand to the defenders of extreme isolationism on the other. The extreme interventionalists insisted that Britain could be saved only by an immediate American declaration of war on Germany, not because of America's inability to fight at once, which was recognized to be small, but because British morale needed such a declaration to provide it with the strength to go on fighting. The isolationists, on the other hand, argued that it was no concern of the United States whether Britain collapsed or survived, since Hitler had no desire to attack America, and, even if he did, the Western Hemisphere could withdraw into itself and survive with security and prosperity. Most American opinion in the summer of 1940 was undecided or confused, but tended to incline to the point of view somewhere between the two extremes. In order to unify America's political front, Roosevelt took two outstanding leaders of the Republican Party, both interventionists, into his cabinet as Secretaries of War and the Navy. Henry L. Stimson had been Secretary of War in the Taft administration and Secretary of State in the Hoover administration. Frank Knox had been the Republican candidate for vice president in 1936. Both were promptly repudiated by the Republican leaders, but played a major role in the Roosevelt administration thereafter. In combination with the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. This gave Roosevelt a preponderantly interventionist cabinet. Roosevelt himself was sympathetic to this point of view, but his strong sense of political realism made him aware of the powerful currents of isolationism in American public opinion, especially in the Midwest. As a consequence, Roosevelt, who seemed to the outside public to be an advanced interventionist, was definitely a restraining influence inside the administration. In his own mind, his role clearly was to act as a brake on his cabinet colleagues, while he used the prestige and publicity of his office to educate American public opinion in the belief that America could not stand alone, isolated in the world, and could not allow Britain to be defeated if any acts of ours could prevent it. Outside the administration, American public opinion was being bombarded and paid, and volunteer agitators of all shades of opinion from inside the country and from abroad. Many of these were organized into lobbying and pressure groups, of which the most notable were on the interventionist side, the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, and on the isolationist side, the America First movement. The controversy reached its peak during the presidential campaign of 1940 and subsequently as Congress enacted into law the vital defensive measures desired by the third Roosevelt administration. The international crisis led Roosevelt to violate the constitutional precedent against a third term. In spite of the fact that the Republican candidate, Wendell Willkie, was in general agreement with Roosevelt's position on foreign affairs, his desire to win the election had led him to indulge in what he subsequently called campaign oratory and to make violent accusations against his opponent. Among others, he assured the American people that Roosevelt's re-election meant that we will be at war. To counteract these charges and to win back anti-war voters who might have been attracted by the generally isolationist outlook of the Republican Party, especially of its senior congressional leaders, Roosevelt replied with some campaign oratory of his own. Some of his assurances were thrown back in his face later. In New York, he said, "We will not send our Army, Navy, or Air Force to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas, except in case of attack." And in Boston, he said most empathetically, "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." This campaign oratory, BS, on both sides was based on the general recognition that the overwhelming majority of Americans were determined to stay out of war. But the confusion in the minds of this majority was revealed on numerous occasions, as on October 5th, 1940, when the Gallup poll of public opinion showed that 70% of Americans felt it was more important to defeat Hitler than to keep out of war. This poll was close enough to Roosevelt's own sentiments for him to feel justified in taking any actions which would increase the chances of a Hitler defeat and improve the ability of America to defend itself. The fall of France raised the problem of American defense in an acute form. The American Army and Air Force were pathetically weak, while the Navy was adequate to its tasks only in the Pacific. To remedy these deficiencies, it was agreed in July 1940 to seek an army of 1,400,000 men and an air force of 18,000 planes by April 1942, and a two-ocean navy increased by 1,325 tons of ships as soon as possible. These objectives could not be achieved in view of the slowness of American mobilization, both economic and military, and were made even more unattainable by the constant demands of Britain, China, Greece, and others for military equipment as soon as it came off the production line. 2 months after these goals had been set, an official memorandum estimated that the United States had no more than 55,000 men in its army and 189 planes in its air force ready for immediate action. September 25th, 1940. As the military forces of the country slowly grew, a series of strategic plans were drawn up to fix the way in which these forces would be used. All these plans decided that Germany was the major danger, with Japan of secondary importance, and accordingly that every effort, including actual warfare, should be used to defeat Germany, and that until this goal was achieved, every effort must be made to postpone any showdown of strength with Japan. The priority of a German defeat over a Japanese defeat was so firmly entrenched in American strategic thinking that, as early as November 1940, it was seriously considered that it might be necessary, if Japan attacked the United States, for the United States to make war on Germany in order to retain this order of priority. As events turned out, Germany's declaration of war on the United States 4 days after the Japanese attack saved the United States from the need to attempt something which American public opinion would never have condoned, an attack on Germany after we had been attacked by Japan. That was kind of like going into Iraq, even though we said Afghanistan did the 9/11. Although $17.7 billion had been appropriated by the American government for rearmaments by October 1940, the actual production of armaments remained insignificant until 1942. There were several reasons for this slow progress. In the first place, the governmental side of the rearmament effort was not centralized because of Roosevelt's ingrained distaste for all unified, centralized administration. Instead, similar and conflicting powers were scattered about among various administrators or were granted to unwieldy committees made up of conflicting personalities, while the really vital powers of duress over labor, industry, or material priorities were largely non-existent. In the second place, industry was very reluctant, in view of the recent economic depression, with its great volume of unused capital equipment, to build new plant or new equipment for defense manufacture unless the government gave them such concessions in regard to prices, taxes, or plant depreciation that the new equipment would cost the corporation little or nothing. Even then, the more monopolistic corporations, which formed the overwhelming majority of the corporations with defense contracts, were reluctant to expand production facilities, since this would jeopardize price and market relationships in the post-war period. Accordingly, most industrialists, especially the largest ones who were in closest contact with the government, rejected the administration's plans for defense production as grandiose and impossible. This was most emphatic following Roosevelt's statements in May 1940 that America's goal was to produce 50,000 planes a year. Although the industry was almost unanimous in calling this a fantastic figure, issued only as a New Deal propagandist trick, America's plane production in the next 5 years was about 6 times this figure and reached 96,000 in 1944. These results were achieved because the government paid for 9/10 of the new factories and compelled modern mass production methods to be adopted by what was still, even in 1941, a handicraft industry. Okay, so basically, the whole capitalism is kind of fake, because it's like a lot of it was built up by the government loans, and basically the government forcing people to work for very cheap during the war. All right. In addition to the reluctance to expand capacity, both industry and labor were reluctant to convert existing equipment from peacetime production to war production at a time when government spending was creating a level of peacetime demand and peacetime profits such as had not been known in many years. Businessmen accepted war contracts but continued to allocate capacity, materials, and labor forces to civilian products because these were more profitable, satisfied old customers who were expected to remain customers in the post war period, and required no conversion of capacity or disruption of distribution facilities. This was particularly true of the automobile industry, which refused to convert or even give up the unnecessary luxury of annual model changeovers until January 1942. The government ended pleasure car manufacture for the duration of the war, but as a result of reluctance to do this earlier, about 2 years of wartime production by the automobile industry was lost, and more pleasure cars were manufactured in 1941 than in almost any year in history. In December 1940, Walter P. Reuther, head of the United Automobile Workers, suggested that the unused capacity of the automobile industry, which he estimated at 50%, be used to produce airplanes. This was rejected by both airplane and automobile manufacturers. The latter insisted that only 10 or 15% of their machine tools could be used in the manufacture of munitions. After the forced conversion of 1942, 66% of these machine tools were used in this way, and the automobile industry eventually built 2/3 of all combat airplane engines produced in the United States between July 1940 and August 1945. In most industries, the government had little or no authority to compel defense contracts to be carried out before civilian contracts, with the result that the latter were generally given preference until 1942. Even in such a vital product as machine tools, no effective system of compulsory priorities for defense was set up until May 1942. This was so typical of the war mobilization that it can be said with assurance that no real mobilization was established until after June 1942. A year later, by July 1943, there had been an astonishing increase. We produced only 16 light tanks in March 1941, and these were too light for service in Europe. Our first medium tank, the General Grant, was finished in April 1941, but 30 months later, late in 1943, we were turning out 3,000 tanks a month. In July 1940, the United States produced 350 combat planes, and in March 1941 could do no better than 506 such planes. But by December 1942, we produced 5,400 planes a month, and in August 1943 reached 7,500. A similar situation existed in shipbuilding. In all of 1939, the United States built only 28 ships, totaling 342,000 tons, and in 1940 could raise this to no more than 53 ships of 641,000 tons. In September 1941, when the German U-boats were aiming to sink 700,000 tons a month, the United States completed only 7 ships of 64,000 tons. But among those 7 ships of September 1941, was the first Liberty ship, a mass production model largely based on British design. 2 years later, in September 1943, the United States launched 155 ships aggregating 1,700,000 tons and was in a position to continue at this rate of 5 ships a day, or 19 million tons a year, indefinitely. It must always be remembered that these impressive figures were reached almost 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. and that for 2 years after the fall of France, the United States faced a critical diplomatic crisis with almost no military resources to fall back on or to meet the piteous appeals for aid which came from Britain, China, Greece, Turkey, Sweden, and a dozen of other countries. Except for Britain, most of these appeals received little satisfaction. China, for example, received only 48 planes in the first 8 months of 1940 and only 9 million worth of all kinds of arms and munitions in the whole year of 1940. Of 2,000 combat planes produced in the United States from July 7, 1940 to February 1st, 1941, 1,500 went to Britain and 607 went to our own Army and Navy. Boxed in between the steady advance of authoritarian aggression, the inadequacy of American war production, the appeals of aggressors' potential victims, and the outraged howls of American isolationists, the Roosevelt administration improvised a policy which consisted in almost equal measure of propagandist public statements, tactical subterfuge, and hesitant half-steps. In September 1940, in spite of the adverse effect it might have on Roosevelt's chances in the November election, the administration persuaded the Congress to enact a Selective Service Act to build up the manpower of the armed forces through compulsion. It provided for 1 year of training for 900,000 men and stipulated that they must not be used outside the Western Hemisphere. In the same month, September 1940, Roosevelt proclaimed a limited national emergency and, by executive fiat, gave 50 old destroyers of World War I to Britain in return for 99-year leases of naval and air bases in British possession in this hemisphere from Newfoundland to Trinidad. The opening of a new session of Congress in January 1941 gave Roosevelt an opportunity to state the aims of America's foreign policy. He did so in the famous Four Freedoms speech. America was looking forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. In casting about for some way in which America could contribute to these ends while still remaining out of the war, and without enraging the isolationists completely, the Roosevelt administration, in the early months of 1941, came up with a number of procedures which they summed up in the phrases "America as the arsenal of democracy" and "Lend-Lease." The arsenal of democracy idea meant that America would do all it could to supply armaments and essential supplies to countries resisting aggressors, especially to Britain. The British side of the idea was reflected in a public statement of Winston Churchill: "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job." These statements are of historical significance because, even as they were being made, the military experts in both America and Britain were trying to persuade the political leaders that material contributions from the United States to Britain, no matter how large, would not be sufficient. American fighting men would also be needed. Of course. The Arsenal of Democracy project, even if not adequate to defeat Hitler by itself, faced the tremendous obstacles of Britain's inability to pay and Britain's inability to ensure that war materials from the United States could be delivered in England. These 2 problems occupied much of Roosevelt's attention in 1941, the one in the months January to March and the other in the months March to December. At the outbreak of the war in September 1939, Britain had about 4.5 billion in assets in dollars, which could be converted readily into dollars to buy supplies in the United States, gold, dollar exchange, or American securities. In the first 16 months of the war, Britain earned another $2 billion of dollars from the sale of gold or of these goods like Scotch whiskey or English woolens, which America was willing to buy. But in that 16 months, Britain paid out nearly 4.5 billion for American goods and placed orders for about another 2.5 billion more, so that the year 1941 opened with British uncommitted dollar reserves down to about 500 million. In the first few months of that year, 1941, Britain was selling United States securities which had been taken over from British subjects at a rate of 10 million per week. It was clear that Britain's ability to pay in dollars for urgently needed supplies was reaching the end. This end could not be postponed by means of loans, since they were forbidden by the Neutrality Acts and the Johnson Act. Moreover, the experience of the First War had shown that loans left most unhappy post-war. Moreover, the experience of the First World War had shown that loans left a most unhappy post-war legacy. To Roosevelt's realistic mind, it seemed foolish to allow monetary considerations to stand as an obstacle in the way of self-defense, as he regarded the survival of Britain. Rather, he felt that the resources of war should be pooled between the United States and Britain so that each could use what it needed from a common store. He emphasized that Englishmen were already dying in our defense and that the British had already given us hundreds of millions of dollars to build factories and machines to manufacture planes, engines, ships, or tanks. They were also giving us, without cost, vital secrets in radar and submarine detection, our first successful liquid-cooled airplane engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, built by Packard in a factory constructed with British money and used in our best escort fighter plane, the P-51 Mustang. Many secret features incorporated in the engines of our B-24 Liberator bombers and the Whittle jet engine, which was later adapted to produce the General Electric Company's jet engine used in the P-80 Shooting Star. As early as December 17, 1940, Roosevelt expressed his point of view to the American people in the following characteristic statement. Suppose my neighbor's house catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him put out the fire. Now what do? I don't say to him before that operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. What is the transaction that goes on? I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. A bill embodying these ideas was introduced in Congress on January 10, 1941, as House Resolution 1776, and became law 2 months later as the Lend-Lease Act. Interesting that they would call it House Resolution 1776. During those 2 months, debate raged both on Capitol Hill and throughout the nation, with the isolationist using every possible argument against it. Senator Burton K. Wheeler, who had been vice presidential nominee on a third-party ticket in 1924 and had become increasingly isolationist and reactionary with the passing years, said that the bill would plow under every fourth American boy. Other opponents argued that Britain had tens of billions in concealed dollar assets, that Lend-Lease was merely a clever trick for foisting the cost of Britain's war onto the backs of American taxpayers. Might be true. Still, others insisted that Lend-Lease was an unneutral act which would arouse German rage and eventually involve the American people in a war they had no need to get in. The bill finally passed by a largely party line vote in the House of Representatives. This vote was 260 to 161, with only 25 Democrats voting against it and only 24 Republicans voting for it. It provided that the president could sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of any defense article to any nation whose defense he found vital to the defense of the United States. The payment could be made to the United States by any payment or repayment in kind or property or any other direct or indirect benefit which the president deems satisfactory. So, I mean, that means pretty much anything when you're saying that it could be any indirect benefit. Okay. By November 1941, $14.3 billion had been provided for carrying out these provisions. The Lend-Lease Act was to expire in 2 years. The change in American public opinion can be judged from the fact that it was renewed in March 1943 by a vote of 476 to 6 in the House and 82 to 0 in the Senate. In spite of the large appropriations for Lend-Lease provided in 1941, it moved little additional supplies to any fighting nation before 1942. The American productive system was almost completely clogged up with unfilled orders which had been placed previously by either the British or the American governments. When the Soviet Union came into war in consequence of Germany's attack in 1941, no additional outlet was provided for Lend-Lease goods by this event because American public opinion was too strongly anti-communist to allow the Soviet Union to partake of the Lend-Lease benefits. Only at the end of the war was Russia admitted to these benefits. Shortly afterwards, the productive logjam in war industries was broken by the so-called Victory Program of August 1941. This program ended the attempt to build a war productive system out of surplus capacity of the peacetime civilian industrial system and courageously faced the issue that adequate economic mobilization for war could be achieved only if it were based on 3 fundamental principles. 1. Civilian production must be curtailed to provide labor, materials, and capital for war industry. 2. Any adequate war industry requires great increase in investments in new industrial capacity. And 3. Economic mobilization is impossible unless there is some degree of centralized control by the government and some degree of duress on businesses, labor, and consumers. As part of this effort, Roosevelt, at the end of August 1941, set up a new agency of government, the Supply Priorities and Allocations Board, which, while it had all the weaknesses of a committee organization in contrast with a single executive organization, began for the first time to face the fact that there could be no real economic mobilization without a single overall plan of priorities and allocations among the many different groups demanding access to economic resources. Behind this whole effort towards economic mobilization was a secret decision of Roosevelt's military advisors made in the summer of 1941 that the war could not be won unless the United States planned eventually to raise a number of men in its armed forces. Raised the number of men in its armed forces to 8 million. An 8 million man army looked very remote in the summer of 1941 as the 900,000 draftees provided by the Selective Service Act of 1940 approached the end of their year of training and eagerly began to prepare to disperse to their civilian activities again. To have permitted this would undoubtedly have inflicted a dangerous blow to the preparedness program. Accordingly, the Roosevelt administration asked the Congress to extend the terms of service of these men. Of course, at once the isolationists were in full cry, and this time they found a greater response in American public opinion. It seemed to many to be unfair to keep in service for several years men who, when they reported for service, had been assured that they need serve for only 1 year. The supporters of the extension argued that America's preparedness and security must take precedence over any such mistaken assurances. An act extending the period of selective service training by an additional 18 months passed the Congress on August 12, 1941, by narrowing the margin of vote to 203 to 202. Once again, the Republicans were solidly opposed to the act, only 21 voting for it, while 133 voted against it. As voting on the extension of selective service was being counted, the historic Atlantic Conference of Roosevelt and Churchill was being held on the battleship Prince of Wales in a small harbor in Newfoundland. After 4 days of conferences, August 9th through 12th, 1941, the chiefs of government of the United States and Britain issued a so-called Atlantic Charter as their first formal enunciation of war aims. According to this document, they renounced all ambitions toward territorial aggrandizement for themselves and for others, hoped to obtain territorial settlements and forms of government in accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned, unless it's communism. If you want communism, you're not allowed to have it. They also aspired to see equal access to trade and raw materials for their states, international economic collaboration, freedom of the seas, and post-war disarmament. Certain differences of outlook which emerged from the discussions between the British and Americans were either omitted or compromised in the public announcement. The British were still in favor of imperial preference and certain measures of bilateralism, commercial discrimination, and economic autocracy. It's autarky, okay, and international trade, while Secretary Hull's influence set the American delegation solidly in opposition to these and in favor of multilateral, non-discriminatory trade relations on most favored nation principles. So that's like proto-globalism. The second difference, which was soon pushed into the background, rested in the contrast between Churchill's desire for some statement of preference for long-range post-war plans for an international organization to replace the League of Nations, and Roosevelt's preference for an immediate post-war system based on police action by the few great powers or even by a simple Anglo-American partnership. At any rate, Roosevelt was too reluctant to rouse the unsleeping dogs of isolationism to allow the Atlantic Conference to issue any public statement on international organization. The Atlantic Charter was issued to the world as soon as the conference ended. At least equal in importance were the simultaneous military and strategic conversations which were kept secret. Once again, these decided that the defeat of Germany must have priority over the defeat of Japan, but there was a wide difference of opinion on how Germany could be defeated. The British had no plans or expectations for making any large-scale invasion of Europe with ground forces. Instead, they hoped that Germany could be worn down to defeat after a very long war by blockade, aerial bombardment, subversive activity, and propaganda. They wanted large numbers of heavy bombers and hoped for American intervention in the war as soon as possible, largely for its propaganda value against German morale. Apparently, no one pointed out that a German defeat by British methods would leave the Soviet armies supreme in all Europe, with no Axis, Anglo-American, or local forces to oppose them. On military grounds alone, the Americans at the Atlantic Conference rejected the British theories. They rejected any immediate American intervention into the war on the grounds that the United States was not sufficiently armed to be effective. The only immediate contribution which the United States could add by intervention, they felt, would be in escorting convoys of British supply vessels to Europe. The American military experts rejected the idea that Germany could be defeated by a blockade, propaganda, air attacks, or by anything less than a large-scale invasion by ground forces. For this purpose, the War Department in Washington was planning an army of 8 million men. An additional difference of opinion between the British and Americans emerged from the discussion regarding Japanese aggression. The British wanted a joint or parallel message to Japan, accompanied, if possible, by threatening naval movements to demand a cessation of aggressive Japanese actions. The Americans were reluctant, fearing to take any steps which might speed up Japanese aggression and thus distract attention from the German problems. Roosevelt even said that continued peace with Japan was so essential that he would turn a deaf ear if Japan went into Thailand, but not if they went into the Dutch East Indies. In the later case, he envisioned nothing more than economic warfare for the considerable period. Immediately following the Atlantic Conference, Roosevelt was concerned with two major European problems, leaving the rising tension with Japan in Hull's hands. The two problems were naval escort of convoys to Britain and military supplies for the Soviet Union. During the spring, summer, and autumn of 1941, Roosevelt was under constant pressure from many of his cabinet to grab the bull by the horns and establish American naval escort of supply ships to Britain. At first, he yielded to this pressure, but by July, he became convinced that American public opinion would not accept convoy escort all the way to Britain, and substituted for his escort to the meridian of Iceland, with the argument that this was still within the Western Hemisphere. Orders to organize convoy escorts all the way to Britain had been issued on February 26th. To protect these, an Atlantic fleet under Admiral King had been created on February 1st. This was reinforced by 3 battleships an aircraft carrier, 4 cruisers, and numerous destroyers transferred from the Pacific in May. In March, Roosevelt ordered 2 destroyer bases and 2 seaplane bases to be constructed with Lend-Lease funds in Northern Ireland and Scotland. At the same time, he gave Britain 10 Coast Guard cutters to be based in Iceland and seized possession of 65 Axis and Danish ships anchored in American harbors. A month later, Greenland was declared to be in the Western Hemisphere. Oh, really? And the United States took over its protection and began to construct bases. The Red Sea was declared not to be a combat area, thus reopening it to American merchant ships carrying supplies to Egypt, April 10, 1941. The financial assets of the Axis powers and all occupied and belligerent countries in Europe were frozen. The Axis consulates in the United States were closed June 14th through the 16th, 1941. American flying schools were made available to train British aviators. 4,000 Marines who had been ordered to occupy the Azores in anticipation of Nazi move towards Gibraltar or the Atlantic Islands were released from this assignment when Hitler moved eastward in June. Accordingly, they were reassigned to occupy Iceland, which they did, in agreement with the Icelandic government in July. In the meantime, by presidential proclamation, the American Neutrality Zone, which had been defined in September 1939 as west of 60 degrees west longitude and extended to 26 degrees west longitude, the meridian of Iceland. The United States Navy was ordered to follow all Axis raiders or submarines west of this meridian, broadcasting their positions to British. On July 19, 1941, American naval convoys were ordered as far eastward as this meridian. The first such convoy left on September 16, 1941. In practice, American escort vessels covered about 1,200 miles of distance in the mid-Atlantic between 52 degrees west and 26 degrees west, picking up from Canadian escorts south of Newfoundland and delivering their charges to British escorts south of Iceland. This gave the Canadians and British routes about 650 miles to cover on either end. By this time, Axis submarines had moved from the waters off the British Isles to the mid-Atlantic, where they were operating by a wolf pack technique. Under this method, as soon as a convoy was discovered, a dozen or more submarines would assemble in its path and attack on the surface at night. This proved to be a very effective method, especially against inexperienced American escorts, which maintained 2 rigid stations, TOO, too close to their convoys. But this method had the great weakness that it required extensive radio communication with Germany for orders. This revealed the locations of the U-boats and eventually became a fatal weakness. American naval escort of British convoys could not fail to lead to a shooting war with Germany. The Roosevelt administration did not shrink from this probability. The growing tension with Japan, combined with the American strategic decision that Germany must be defeated before Japan to compel an increasingly active policy in the Atlantic in order to avoid a situation where we would be at war in the Pacific while still at peace with Germany. Fortunately for the administration's plans, Hitler played into its hands by declaring war on the United States on December 11, 1941. By that date, incidents were becoming more frequent. On October 17th, the United States destroyer Kearney suffered casualties when it was torpedoed. 2 weeks later, the destroyer Reuben James was blown to pieces with great loss of life by a chain of explosives from a German torpedo, its own forward magazine, and its own depth charges. On November 10th, an American escort of 11 vessels, including the carrier Ranger, picked up a convoy of 6 vessels, including America's 3 largest ocean liners, the America, the Washington, and the Manhattan, with 20,000 British troops, and guarded them from off Halifax to India to Singapore. Pearl Harbor was attacked as this convoy was passing South Africa, and the Washington eventually reached home by crossing the Pacific to California. Many of the activities of the American Navy in the summer of 1941 were not known at all, or were known only very imperfectly to the American public, but it would seem that public opinion generally supported the administration's actions. In September, Roosevelt sought congressional action to repeal the section of the Neutrality Act forbidding the arming of merchant vessels. This was done on October 17th, the vote in the House going 259 to 138, with only 21 Democrats opposing the change and only 39 Republicans supporting it. On the same day, the Kearney was torpedoed. 2 weeks later, all the essential portions of the Neutrality Acts were repealed, November 13th. The vote in the House, 212 to 194, once again showed the partisan nature of the administration's foreign policy, for only 22 of 159 Republicans were for repeal. By this vote, the United States resumed its traditional right to send its ships wherever it pleased and to arm and protect them in every way possible. This meant that open naval warfare with Germany was in the immediate future. During this period, from June to December 1941, Roosevelt was also kept occupied by the problem of military aid for the Soviet Union. The Nazi forces, which flung themselves on Russia on June 22, 1941, were at the peak of their power, and the Soviet Union was soon in grave need of any aid it could get. Churchill, although filled with suspicions of the Soviet regime or the good faith of its leaders, was willing to accept anyone, even the devil, as he put it himself, as an ally against the Nazi menace, and to extend whatever aid was available to such an ally. Roosevelt shared these ideas to a considerable extent, but the American people were suspicious of Bolshevism, and American military experts were generally agreed that the Soviet Union could not hold out against Hitler long enough for any aid to be effective. Accordingly, it was several months before Roosevelt was in position to make Lend-Lease supplies available to the Kremlin. All right, I'm just going to stop there. The next section is the Nazi attack on Soviet Russia, 1941 to 1942. That's going to be on page 721. The link for the PDF is in the description if you want to check it out yourself. So, basically, I think this is pretty common American history that, there was the isolationists that didn't want to go into World War II. And then the attack on Pearl Harbor was basically the catalyst that changed public opinion to get everybody into the war. So, pretty much not too much to talk about in that chapter right there. So, that's about it for this video. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.